Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Lysing, and this is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome back to the conversation. Well, it's that time of year again. We've got the Chainalysis 2023 Crypto Crime Report to talk about. To discuss that, I am joined by the Cyber Crimes Research Lead, Eric Jardine. He's with Chainalysis. So we talk all about the overall drop in crypto crime. Get this, last year it accounted for 0.34% of all crypto on-chain activity. So not even 1% is crime. So I'm sorry to have to break that news to you, Senator Elizabeth Warren. That is down from 0.42% of all on-chain activity in 2022. So crime is actually down. We talk about all the other kind of interesting categories of crime, like ransomware, darknet markets, the always interesting pig butchering. We discuss whether security is improving for DeFi protocols, or is it just that there isn't as much activity out there and therefore as much money to steal. So Eric was really great with all his time and insights, and we got into all this stuff, which I always find really fascinating. I hope you do too. Thanks for being here, and thanks for your support. Hey Eric, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I always look forward to these conversations with you guys at Chainalysis, and it's time for this one to go over the 2023 Crypto Crime Report. So thank you very much for joining me. You have a really cool title. You're a Cyber Crimes Research Lead at Chainalysis. I thought at the beginning, maybe you could just tell folks at a high level kind of what you do and how you are able to go about kind of not only sniffing out crimes that are happening on the blockchain, but like how you actually go about, following the breadcrumbs and like trying to put things together and how it maybe, for people who might not understand, with a blockchain, it's a public record and pretty much all the transactions are right there if you know what to look for. So I was hoping you might just be able to kind of give us a big overview of that before we kind of get into some of the details and the different types of crime.
Sure, happy to do so. So like my day-to-day is pretty, I find it fun. I'm sure others do too. If you like, numbers and trends and patterns and trying to unearth, a detailed record of who's doing what. And that's basically how I spend my time in the main. I tend to think of myself as kind of like a macro-oriented researcher. So when you're dealing with something like analyzing blockchain data, you could have kind of an investigative lens where you're very specifically looking for like a specific one address to another address to another address, trying to trace out the flow of funds from a specific incident as it moves along chain. And sometimes we do stuff of that sort. But what I tend to do by and large is more big picture glimpses of things. So what's happening with the stolen fund landscape, what's happening with scamming activity on chain. And often it's taking those individual instances that someone with a more investigative bent would be looking at and aggregating them up into this higher level picture, which would culminate in something like the crypto crime report that we put out each year. What that implies, to get to the second part of what you were asking, is like you're tracing over time, for example, a record of who's transacting with whom. And if you're looking at one of the various blockchains that we track, it's going to be a record of an address sending value to another address, or from that other address's standpoint, receiving value from an origin point. And that might be a direct transfer. It might be multiple hops. All of these sorts of things are possible depending on what kind of question you're trying to ask or answer. And where the sort of machine readable blockchain kind of gets overlaid with something that's intelligible to us mere mortals is through a process of kind of attribution, where you'd be saying this address is associated with this entity. You may know this specific entity's name, or it may be some service, like, for example.
To make it a little more concrete, maybe it's like the Lazarus Group in North Korea, right?
Exactly. So it could be a Lazarus address wallet. It could be a darknet market like Hydra or one of those ones. And if you have a ground truth on that attribution, then you can start to make inferences about who's sending value to that particular service of a given type in the sort of illicit actor domain. And then you can start to produce charts and figures and estimates like we have in the crypto crime report from there.
So I would imagine if you do know, like, okay, this is a Hydra wallet, let's just say, and that's a darknet market that was very big in Russia. It got shut down a couple of years ago. You would sort of have like a Google alert on that address and just like always be tracking like, oh, there's new funds moving around. We should maybe look at that. Is that one way that you sort of keep up on this sort of activity?
Well, you certainly could. If that was something you wanted to do, you could set up alerts for the flow of value. For example, like if you wanted to know if a wallet, like wallets that had been previously dormant started moving, for example, if there's something of that sort, which especially in something like attempting to do recovery of stolen funds, that might be something you're very interested in. If the funds get moved out of a victim's wallet and they're sitting on chain, you want to know when they start to move, because that might mean someone's trying to launder or off ramp, for example. So you want to be keeping a very close eye on that. Yeah. It's certainly something you can do. You can also be a bit more passive in the approach if you're generally interested in trends over months, weeks, quarters, whatever time unit it happens to be. You could just be doing a periodic pull of the data to sort of aggregate data and say like, oh yeah, we are seeing something anomalous happening here where Hydra's share fall. I mean, Hydra may be a kind of an antiquated example at this point, but a darknet market, its activity seems to be dropping through the roof. Something must have happened, even if you don't have warning through a different channel, like an OSINT or a channel, or you don't know a public event. If all of a sudden it collapses to zero, something's happened, and then you can sort of work backward from that on-chain record to try to find out what's going on.
In how many instances do you have like law enforcement come to you or ask you for help, and that's how you start, kind of investigating? Is that a minority of what you guys are doing? Is it a majority? Like how does that interplay with all the different? Because there's a lot of we're going to get into this, but there's like scams, there's hacking, there's a whole bunch of different stuff. But I'm just curious how much of that is driven by somebody coming to you, maybe a regulator or law enforcement of some sort to say like, hey, we need some help with what's going on here.
Well, I can't speak to specific numbers there because I'm on a different, I focus on public facing macro related research. And so from my standpoint, it's more that I'm tracking the ecosystem broadly, seeing who's talking about what, and from there, sort of trying to formulate interesting views on the data that like feed into these discussions that are happening widely. So like I'm not an investigator per se, so I can't really comment on that side of it. I'm a macro researcher focusing on the public side, the publicly available side, like the crypto crime report.
So in that instance, would a story like what happened with Tornado Cash kind of be something that you were, that's something that you're following and are kind of like forming opinions about or something like that?
Like it's sanctioning, you mean?
Yeah. Was it last year or was it 2 years ago now, when it got put on the OFAC list? And I'm just curious, it sounds like you're trying to make narratives out of the data. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and like just to be clear, like narrative can be a kind of a loaded term because it might sound like you're trying to like tell a story like you're in Plato's cave. What that really means in context is like we see what the data says, see what's of public interest based on that, and that's what we share. So we're not like cooking the books or anything like that.
No, I didn't mean that. I just meant that like you're trying to make sense of it all so that you can tell a story about what's happening in the wider cryptocurrency market.
Yeah, when in the Tornado Cash example, when OFAC did its designation, which was in August of 2022, that was definitely something that we wrote about at the time. We covered extensively in last year's crypto crime report because it was one of those big changes to OFAC's approach. They'd previously, prior to 2022, they hadn't been really focusing on sanctioning big services. Right. And then we had a cascade of Hydra, Garantex, and then Tornado Cash, which were all sort of a break with the previous pattern.
Yeah, with Tornado Cash, the sanctioning was a list of smart contracts, which I found quite amazing. Now, like specifically to the 2023 crime report, what is there anything that jumped out at you, or what was anything surprising, or something that caught you off guard, or what was kind of the one or two things that you came away with that were interesting to you?
I think there's a couple of things that worth bearing mention at the highest possible level. So, for example, we have, as we've seen in other years, an increase in the total amount of illicit activity that we tracked during the course of the year in dollar denominated terms, and simultaneously a reduction in the share of that activity relative to everything we're observing on chain. So these are like two different ways of measuring illicit activity, whether it's in absolute terms, that dollar denominated amount, or as a rate relative to overall on-chain activity.
Right.
And it's one of those things that I find interesting and useful context for conversations like this, because it's basically, you get two different trends there, where one's getting worse over time, dollar denominated amounts, but the rates kind of hovering at or even declining over time if you were to overlay a trend line. If you're thinking about something like crime, whether it's off-chain or on-chain for that matter, it's usually important to kind of focus or emphasize that rate dimension, because it gives you a sense of the denominator, which means like bigger populations, more transactions. They tend to be associated with more of everything, not just more of the good stuff. And that's what the rate measure shows. But then the dollar amounts are also relevant depending on your point of reference. And so we see some pretty big jumps this year in terms of the total amount of illicit activity that we observed. And so, I think that kind of difference between those two ways of framing illicit activity is always one of the things that strikes me about the report in this sort of broad intro summary. Another thing that I think is worthwhile to kind of emphasize is that like we've seen in previous years, a lot of specific forms of illicit activity, both scamming and stolen funds, in this case being two examples, actually fell year over year into 2023. And in the case of scams, at least, that's the second year over year reduction that we've observed. So stolen funds doesn't quite fit that pattern, because it was up 8% last year in the 2023 report, which is on the 2022 year. Yeah. But it was pretty close. Like, we're basically tracking an interesting drawdown in some forms of illicit activity that I think, we can talk about it more. It needs to be kind of qualified and unpacked in terms of what that drawdown implies. But I think that the fact that not all crime is just constantly going up and to the right is a pretty relevant takeaway from the report. Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to talk about that too at the top here. So just to put some numbers to what you're saying, if you account for all activity on chain, crime in 2023 was 0.34% of all activity. That's down from 2022 when it was 0.42% of all activity. So it's not even 1%. And I feel like that's a really important distinction and fact to get out there to people, especially, and I've written about this, a lot and talked about it a lot, when Elizabeth Warren and other politicians who seem hell-bent on kind of trying to destroy crypto are out there saying publicly that all it's used for is money laundering and terrorist financing and crime. And the numbers just don't back that up. It's not even close. How is this being used, I guess, in the wider public policy debate? Is this something that you guys are trying to get in front of politicians and regulators and saying, like, look, here are the numbers, let's have this debate, but let's use some facts and use some research, and not just maybe like ad hominem attacks?
Well, I think we certainly view our efforts in this respect as trying to provide kind of a data substrate to public policy discussions globally, where you want to be able to quantify, I think, to the greatest extent possible, things like illicit use of blockchains. It's something where you can, you could get focused in on a specific instance and then, incorrectly read that as a generalized problem, for example. And what we're able to do, or at least endeavor to do with this sort of estimation in the report, is essentially say, like, here is an over time consistently applied approach to measuring illicit activity on chain. And as you said, like, I like to think of the share dimension as essentially a 1% problem. If you look at the longer term trend, it kind of goes like this, usually hovering below 1%. And as we point out in the introductory section, there's some qualifiers to that, like we improve our attribution over time, for example, which means more illicit activity gets counted, which usually leads to an upward revision.
Yeah, in 2022, I was a little, not amazed, but your original estimate was somewhere around 2 billion in illicit activity, and then 20 and then it got doubled to 40 billion just in the interim. So and that's for people, like that's as you guys find more addresses that are linked with illicit activity and you uncover more bad actors out there, that number usually grows over time.
It does, yeah. And just very briefly on that specific year, I mean, there were a couple of other data changes that weren't like that growth, almost like 100% or doubling of the amount is not the normal rate at which we see a revision upwards. In this case, we've included things like the FTX creditor claims for 8.7 billion. We've included sanctioned jurisdiction for the first time, for example, in that estimate for the year. It's in every year now, so it's like a wholesale revision in that particular case. So normally the numbers don't jump 100%, but they would jump, fairly consistently on any given category. You might see 10, 20, 25, 30% jump is not impossible, depending on what kind of data lag you might have with the attribution process.
Yeah, and so you mentioned FTX there, and that was another interesting point in the report, because that's not an on-chain event. That was exchanges are not on chain. The money that's in an exchange is, in different accounts. And basically what happened was, people made off with customer money, and that $8.7 billion is what the customers are claiming they're owed. After the verdict, I think in December, you guys decided to include that as a type of fraud for the first time because it's off chain. Was that a hard decision for you guys internally, or what? I know like that's the first time it's happened, but was there any debate inside Chainalysis about what to do with that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky one, and as you said, it is the private order books of an exchange, for example, are not an on-chain phenomenon.
Right.
So in that sense, it is a bit of a departure from what we normally would be tracking. Ultimately, as we note in the assumptions and so forth in the intro, what we decided on was, in this case, since a verdict has been rendered, we would treat that as something of relevance to the estimation of crypto-related crime.
Yeah.
So this is one of those, it is one of those sort of exceptional cases where, if the crime was happening in an order book and then it percolated and had broad-based impacts and so on and so forth, it's kind of tricky to say how you should necessarily proceed. But as we detailed, this is a case of relevance to the crypto ecosystem, and so we decided in this instance since a decision had been rendered, we decided to treat it as illicit in the course of 2022.
Yeah, and I guess going forward, if there are other criminal decisions that come down, that'll probably maybe result in the same sort of thing where those numbers get added into the bigger pot. Yeah, so maybe we could get a little specific here and talk about some of the ransomware and darknet market activity. Those were kind of outliers. They were both increased last year versus 2022. With ransomware, are you seeing a trend there? What do you guys attribute that to? And as people probably know, this is where hackers or other people take over, usually like computer systems and hold you, they say you got to pay us in Bitcoin or stable coins, and then we'll unfreeze your hospital operating system or whatever it is. But I'm just curious what you guys attribute those increases to.
Yeah. So what's interesting about those two areas, as you said, is they saw year-over-year growth. There is an important base rate effect in both cases that needs to be brought up, which is in the darknet market instance, 2022 saw the closure of Hydra, which was the largest darknet market at the time. It had about 90% market share, and it was closed in April, sort of through a combination of an enforcement effort and an OFAC sanctioning event. And while the ecosystem has always, over the long run, tended to recover, the darknet market ecosystem. It nonetheless made a fairly sizable dent because people pull back a little bit from using darknet markets in the immediate aftermath of an enforcement event as they try to figure out, who knows what markets are a good secondary candidate for use and all these other sorts of things. And so what we've partially observed with this recovery is a regrowth back to baseline, the baseline trend, and basically it's a recovery in the case of darknet markets. And something similar is sort of happening with ransomware. So we, in our mid-year report, which we published around July of 2023, we'd observed that ransomware was trending through the first half of last year to be on pace for 2021 kind of levels, which would be a complete reversion back to the pre-2022 amounts, because 2022 was a pretty sizable drawdown year over year, where we saw a decrease, if memory serves, like of several hundred million.
I think I remember that and writing about it. And I think one of the reasons you guys cited was that people were getting tougher and they were saying like, no.
Yes.
More.
So there's repayment questions. There was disruptions to the ransomware illicit actor ecosystem as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There were a variety of factors kind of weighing in that kind of acted as an anchor on the 2022 ransomware ecosystem in a positive way.
See, that's what I find so fascinating about this stuff is like that the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine would affect ransomware, overall activity. It's just that those knock-on effects I find just really, really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So that's all to say, like we did see an increase year over year. The base rate effect for those two categories means what that increase implies is not necessarily a big uptick. It's not like the kind of jump we've observed in some categories in years past, where, for example, from 2020 into 2021, stolen fund activity increased like 500%. It's not that kind of jump that we were observing. It's more like the base rate was low. We're seeing a reversion back to the trend that we would have expected had 2022 kind of just not been there. Because both of these categories of illicit activity had some positives to them, where enforcement activity and greater resiliency in the case of targets of potential ransomware, these sorts of things were kind of weighing into the equation.
I'm just curious, and if you can't talk about this yet, you can just say so, but is there a market like Hydra that has kind of come in, and replaced it? Is there like one big one out there that's sort of come from the ashes?
We track that kind of activity quite a bit. And we did so extensively during the course of 2022, because that was kind of like the burning question at that time, was like, what's next?
Yeah.
And what we observed was this interesting pattern where a clear winner heading into 2023 hadn't yet been kind of decided. So what we saw was like OMG immediately in the aftermath of Hydra's closure kind of sprang out from nowhere. Now, what's interesting about that market was like it had an on-chain presence well before Hydra was closed, but didn't really do much. And then almost immediately we saw a giant spike in activity, which sort of suggests, someone somewhere was running parallel infrastructure, was able to do some direction of people to that site as kind of like a common focal point of illicit activity. OMG then stumbled. Blacksprut, Mega, they kind of emerged from there. Kraken became a contender during the course of 2023. So
that's different than Kraken the exchange, of course.
Not Kraken the exchange.
Yeah, we should make that clear.
Yes, be very
Jesse
clear.
Powell
Yes.
is not running a darknet market.
That is correct. It is Kraken the darknet market we are talking about.
Okay. Now, another trend that's interesting is stablecoins have taken over as the kind of coin of the realm for most of the illicit activity you guys are tracking. Just a few years ago, it was Bitcoin, followed a little bit, by Ether. But now stablecoins are, like, according to you guys, it looked to me about 65% of all criminal activity is, that people are asking for stablecoins like Tether or US dollar coin. What does that tell you? And one thing that popped into my head was, wouldn't that make there more of a trail? Because obviously you have to get into crypto, you have to buy your Bitcoin or Ether, and then you have to go to an exchange and get your stable coin. So it just seems like there's another link in that chain that could like, be beneficial to folks like you or law enforcement who are trying to track where this stuff goes. Or am I missing something in that?
So just one clarification. The 2023 by volume, stablecoins was representing a fair amount of that overall aggregate activity. By type of crime, we definitely see differences. So ransomware is almost entirely dominated still by Bitcoin. Scams is a bit more of a mixture where there's like a stablecoin scamming ecosystem and a Bitcoin one and a bit of Ethereum and others in the mix. And there's just a couple of categories where stablecoins seem to predominate, but you definitely like darknet markets is another example, like Bitcoin, almost strictly speaking, Bitcoin only. Okay. Your question about like, well, what does that pivot kind of imply in general broad terms? I mean, one thing that I would emphasize is, especially in some cases at least, and we've seen a lot of examples of this during the course of 2023, stablecoin issuers can freeze funds, burn funds. And so we have examples of that where illicit activity was recorded and one of the issuers basically steps in to freeze the funds.
Yeah, that happened with Tether not too long ago.
Exactly. And so this is, for example, like part of the reason you wouldn't see, in my view, stablecoins being used for ransomware payments, because the ransomware operators would be adding to their operations a new hurdle that seems, from my standpoint, to be kind of unnecessary. Where why would they ask, like, if they targeted a victim and asked for payment in a stablecoin, they're basically asking to have those funds frozen.
Because it's one of the few areas that's centralized, right? There's a centralized actor behind the stablecoin issuer. Like it's the stablecoin issuer who like right. You're saying, can do that.
Exactly. The operational risks that get added to an illicit actor's activities from using stablecoins are not negligible because of this phenomenon like we've been talking about, like this ability to freeze and monitor and all that. And so, we do see it. We do see stables playing a larger role in 2023 than they have historically. However, it is confined to some specific forms of illicit activity and not others, simply because using it in some cases is, as far as I could tell, would be just like a terrible plan.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think I was sort of like getting at that at some point with like thinking, this is an extra step in the whole process. So why do it if you're a criminal? Why not just make it as simple as possible? And then, so, we're talking about different types of scams, and this is always, I've got to ask you about pig butchering because I love that term. And maybe you could just like real briefly for folks, just kind of describe what that is. And then we'll get into sort of like some of the findings that you guys mentioned in the report. But yeah,
sure.
What is pig butchering for folks who might not have ever heard that?
Yeah, so it's not the most flattering of terms because the pig in this case refers to the victim. And it isn't the most descriptively clear term. I mean, I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, what are you talking about?
It's hard to forget, though.
What it refers to, it is essentially a tactical approach where scammers establish a relationship with victims. And through that relationship, it can be friendship, it can be romance. I mean, that's kind of a spectrum. Mm-hmm. And I think scammers would be opportunistic enough to be willing to fall anywhere on that, where it's like a new friend that would then direct you to a site to maximize your investment returns through crypto, or a romantic relationship where they'd be trying to obtain funds from a potential victim. And the goal is essentially you build the relationship and you then leverage that relationship to get people to participate in usually some sort of investment related scam. So that might be, through a friendship, directing them to some sort of like investment return scam, or as we document in one portion of the report, it might be even more direct than that. Like in the approval phishing case, which we can talk about, it's more like convincing someone to give you spending prerogative on their wallet, and then you drain it.
Right. This is because there's these personal relationships that are built up. A lot of times the reporting on this type of criminal activity is hard, right? Because people are kind of ashamed, and it's not something that they want to admit to. So you guys have that sort of barrier, or not? It's a hurdle, I guess, for really figuring out what the actual level of this kind of criminal activity is.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there are a few actually, like with something like scamming activity generally, and ones that have a big interpersonal dimension, like pig butchering. You have social stigma, like the thing you were talking about, where people sometimes feel ashamed that they were scammed, they're embarrassed, and that leads to an underreporting. You also have the sort of like unwillingness to believe that they were scammed by a friend or a romantic connection, where they just won't face the reality of the situation. And that would, again, it would lead to underreporting. And the interpersonal dimension also makes on-chain identification and attribution a bit of a challenge, because it means it's often very individualized, as opposed to something that's a scam that's orchestrated through some sort of centralized hub that's a bit easier to potentially track or identify and track. So yeah, there's a lot of barriers, and as we detail in multiple different places, we do think that our scam estimations are definitely a lower boundary estimate of what we are observing in terms of scam-related activity. That's probably significantly higher. Exactly how much is kind of it's an empirical question that would be hard to kind of guess and estimate at, but it's definitely higher than what we've got recorded as kind of ground truth at a lower bound.
One other thing that stuck out to me from the report was that so decentralized finance protocols, are notoriously prone to hacking. They don't usually have great security. It's not like something that they, I think, usually put first. But it sounds like in 2023, at least, that the amount of funds stolen or just sort of lost in DeFi hacks went down, and you guys said that potentially security is getting better with these protocols. So I just wanted to ask you about that, and do you think it's a coincidence, or are you hearing from folks that you're talking to that this is now more of a priority than it used to be?
Yeah, so the DeFi related stolen fund activity was down a lot. You were talking like 63% year over year. And I do think security is a factor in that decline. Now, there's others we could potentially talk about to like give a full context to that sort of thing. But as we detail in that section, firms like Halborn sort of are seeing a greater emphasis on code audits for smart contracts, things of that nature. And those are all to the good in terms of improving the security of the ecosystem. Now, the one sort of caveat to the security dimension here from my standpoint is we have had for DeFi a rough year and a bit.
Yeah.
And what that usually implies is you'll get kind of a winnowing down of participants, and you'll end with a core group that are trying to do it well. And so where the real test for this sort of security question when it comes to DeFi is going to be during the next bull market, and whether new participants that come into the space to build new DeFi protocols, as they should, whether they adopt this sort of security first mindset that seems to be increasingly common in the current crop of market participants. Because once you get into bull market territory, things can change. You could get back into a be first to market and think of security second kind of mindset, like we've seen historically across a wide range of technologies. So that's sort of a open question. What will happen next bull run is going to be quite a determinative factor in terms of how well security has improved, or at least how sticky it is going forward. But things like increased code audit rates is a great sign.
Yeah, that is good. I like to hear that. Still, my gut is that, people are going to want to break things and move fast rather than like do a lot of security. It just seems like integral to this industry. And also I think it seems like there's such a churn and like new teams are coming out all the time. It's not necessarily the same folks that are putting out, oh, they did this protocol, now they're doing another and they're doing a third. It's like, you've got folks who are doing this for the first time. And so the security is kind of an afterthought, but people, please put the security first. It's better. It's best for everybody.
It definitely is. Yeah.
And speaking of that, we touched on North Korea, and one of their, the Lazarus group is a group of hackers that's supported by North Korea. I'm not sure that they're actually in North Korea. This is a question I've always had. I think they're probably around the world, but North Korea kind of gives them cover and allows them to use the nation state sort of for what they're doing. I think in 2022, they had stolen something like 1.7 billion. And then last year, you guys had that more like 1 billion. I don't really have a question here, but I'm just curious if what the latest thinking on that is. I know, certain folks in our government in the United States feel like, this is a national security threat because a lot of people think that money is going straight into fund North Korea's nuclear weapons research program. What's the thinking there on the Lazarus group? Do you feel like folks are getting their arms around those guys, or are they still sort of out there and sort of have free reign to do what they're doing?
An important additional data point when talking about DPRK related stolen fund activity is while we did see that drawdown in value, we actually saw the opposite in terms of events.
So more events, but less money stolen.
Exactly. So okay. In that sense, it's an important qualification to their on-chain related hacking activity, because it's sort of like they're not doing less, they're getting less.
Maybe they just weren't as successful as they have been in the past.
Right. And I think it pivots back to the DeFi security question and some of the additional context that I was mentioning. In particular, at this point, there's simply less to steal than there was before. So amount of TVL, for example, is down across most protocols relative to their peaks. So that has implications because the theft occurs at a given point in time. Assets that are locked and or taken have a given value at that point. So the amount stolen when converted into US dollars can decline, but it's an artifact of how much is around to steal.
Yeah.
There's a great quip. Who said it? I forget, but it was basically someone was asked, "Why did you rob the bank?" And the answer was, "That's where the money is."
Yeah. And
it's sort of that kind of logic at a TVL level. Like we have to think through the DPRK's activity, both in terms of the dollar amounts, but also in terms of the events, simply because there's less to steal. So I wouldn't overinterpret a drawdown in amount stolen as a sign that DPRK related on-chain bad action is lessening necessarily.
Yeah, that's great context. And I remember, I think the Ronin Bridge was a big one that was hacked for, I want to say it was $1 billion or plus dollars. And I think North Korea was behind some of that. And so when, bridges were new and sort of like not really great security, I think that those were a fat target. And I think, like you're saying, not a lot of that money is still there to be stolen. Well, Eric, thank you so much for all this insight. I really appreciate it. It's great talking to you. I'm just always fascinated by how you guys are able to track this stuff and kind of chase the bad guys around on the blockchain. It just really is very cool. Tell folks how they can learn more about Chainalysis or learn more about you and if they want to know more, about what's going on.
Sure. Yeah. My suggestion, if this kind of content is of interest, we have our blog at Chainalysis that I would suggest people go to. It's kind of a living record of the research that we do and we put out. It includes the pre-releases for things like the report. So all very publicly accessible, easy to access, and you can kind of work back through the archive if some of the stuff we've referenced, like the mid-year report, would be of interest to sort of see where we were at and our thinking in July. And you see the pre-release sections of the crypto crime report. The full report should be out February, March-ish, that kind of thing. So that would be I think a main point of interest for, I think, a lot of listeners.
I agree. I think it's fascinating. And you guys have been doing this great work for many years. So there's a lot to dive into from past reports. Well, Eric, again, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And it was great talking to you, and best of luck at Chainalysis going forward.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. Thank you for your time.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us, and make sure to subscribe and rate us at Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Decent People is a production of Decential Media. It is produced by Curtis Fritsch, with music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Ives.